So, hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. This week we're delighted to be joined by Peter Klepp, the Editor-in-Chief of Brussels Report, and also our colleague, Research Fellow Richard Schenk. Welcome to you both.
Yeah. Nice to be here.
So this week we're going to be touching on the collapse of the German government. We'll be taking a look at European leaders' reaction to the election of Donald Trump. And also we're going to be getting a little bit of feedback on the Commissioner hearings which have been taking place over the last few days. And in addition, I wanted to touch on something that kind of started or framing out the news this week and has really shocked a lot of people. And this is the horrific, essentially rioting in response to the football match in Amsterdam involved the Israeli team. Now, this has shocked a lot of people. Everybody's been commenting on it. Even the Dutch kings kind of got involved to make comment. And the thing that's stood out for us has been the way that so many people have played this down as if it's just another day in football history where every weekend there's football fans engaging in anti-Semitic rioting, hunting down Jews in the street. It's been really shocking to me. But Peter, what have you made of both the events themselves and also the reaction to them?
Well, in a way, it's unrelated to the football game. It all happened after the game, during the night, when youngsters were chasing Jewish people in Amsterdam and pushing them into the canals, forcing them to shout "Free Palestine." Even going around, asking a random Ukrainian refugee if they weren't perhaps Jewish and forcing this person to show his passport. That was terrible and shocking, and it's just a testimony of the anti-Semitism that you have typically with migrant communities. We know that many of them were from Northern African minorities because you could hear their accents on the videos that they proudly published on social media themselves. Also shocking was the fact that many people in Belgium and the Netherlands were trying to sort of justify this, saying, look, some of these Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were involved in dragging down a Palestinian flag from a building, as if that is somehow equivalent. There seems to have been also an incident with a taxi driver. We don't know exactly what happened, but that seems to have motivated the community of taxi drivers or a part of it, obviously only a part of it, to take part in this what has been labeled a pogrom. By some people, perhaps that's too strong, but it's clear that on social media they were using the hashtag Hunt the Jews.
Yeah, and Richard, I mean, one of the things this represents, quite apart from everything that Peter's touched on, is almost as if Islamist communities in Europe are undergoing their own kind of Hamas-ification, if you like. The kind of rhetoric's escalating. We've moved from demonstrations shouting anti-Semitic slogans, which we saw earlier in the year, to now actual Jew hunting on the streets of Europe.
This is absolutely a phenomenon that we see all across Europe and also even in North America since October the 7th last year, so since over 1 year. And I think this really has changed the migration debate in European countries a lot. Actually, in the Netherlands, it's very interesting. We have had a government that was struggling to find its position on asylum and migration in the last month. And Geert Wilders, who is a part of the government coalition, he made the point that there is a migration emergency. And the lefty opposition criticized him very much for this approach, and also within the government coalition, which has centrist elements, he struggled to make this narrative. But now the entire Dutch politics will be changed, because obviously there is some kind of emergency going on in Europe, and this has very serious implications on the long term how migration policies will be seen in Europe, and this continues. It's over 1 year, and it's something that has changed the migration debate in the political center very much already.
Yeah, and Peter, one of the things that's stood out for me is, I mean, not only have we seen after the events, we've seen almost militant Islamist groups in Holland publishing videos encouraging people to join their organizations and things. But it suggests that problem of migration, as Richard has put it, that anti-Semitism has really become the way to understand it. Not in the sense that all we care about is whether they support Israel or not, but that because casual Jew hatred has become so normalized that this is what's really exposing the migration problem in Europe.
I agree. It's indeed evidence of a deep-rooted problem. Of course, we have anti-Semitism in our native European population, if we can call it like that as well. You can see that when you look at the double standards to which they hold Israel. I think even if you take a very critical view towards the Israeli state and the most critical view possible towards its operation in Gaza, it's very bizarre that then it's very bizarre to then only obsess about that specific conflict and to never say anything about what is happening, for example, in Sudan, where I think 1 million people are being displaced after some groups, like armed groups, chasing people away, also based on their ethnicity. But of course, on top of the native old-fashioned anti-Semitism, we have the imported anti-Semitism. Karl Lagerfeld, a German fashion designer, when he was still alive, he got in trouble for saying that Germany had imported millions of people from cultures where anti-Semitism was basically mainstream. Well, that is just a fact. And I think if you want to solve a problem, you have to dare to talk about it first. And what you see now in many of the protests against Israel is that, never mind anti-Semitism, open calls to violence are simply being tolerated by the authorities, certainly in Belgium, but also in the Netherlands. In Belgium, the leader of Samidun, which is one of the organizations at the heart of this, he is a Palestinian person, and he enjoys asylum here in Belgium, whereas this organization is outlawed in Germany after they handed out cookies following the October terrorist attack of October 2023.
Yeah, and Richard, one of the things that it kind of symbolizes in a way is not just about anti-Semitism, as terrible as that is, but it suggests that there's this kind of broad-rooted hostility to the West as well among these immigrant populations.
That would be a bit too harsh, to be honest. But what we certainly see that there's at least a large and often militant minority in migrant communities here in Europe. But on the other side, we have to be also fair to migrants to Europe. Many of them came to us because they don't want to live under the conditions that dominated in their homes. So, but still, it remains a large problem. These are still hundreds of thousands of people who are susceptible to this anti-Semitic narratives here in Europe. And here in Brussels, the ultimate capitulation was when in September, I think, the football match between Israel and Belgium had to be called off because the local authorities couldn't guarantee the safety of the Israeli supporters. The football match was actually took place in Hungary, which tells a lot about the state of security for Jews in Europe. But now we know why that the Belgian authorities actually were right. They could not guarantee the safety of the Israeli supporters.
Yeah. So one of the stories that's really been sending shockwaves throughout Europe, although many people had seen it coming for a while, is the collapse of the German government. Richard, obviously this is something you've been following really closely. What was the initial cause of the collapse, and then what was really underlying it in a longer term way?
So the whole initial problem was in autumn 23, when the Constitutional Court blew a gaping hole into the budget of the German federal government. And this blatantly exposed the divergent economic policies of the three parties in the government. The Social Democrats were elected because they promised to increase pensions, to increase welfare payments. The Greens were successful because they promised a lot of money for the ecological transition of the economy, and the Liberals were very popular because they promised to not increase taxes. And these three goals actually were completely contradictory. And since this Constitutional Court verdict, there was no going back for this coalition. They just simply run out of money. And now this whole house of cards collapsed, and I was just wondering why it took almost 1 year. Certainly because the German political system is set up in a way that this encourages snap elections.
And in a way, do we have to go back to the weirdness of the coalition as such, which as you've indicated, three parties maybe disagreeing on lots of things, but the only thing that united them really was the desire to keep out the undesirable parties and to form a kind of grand coalition that formed its own cordon sanitaire against especially the AfD.
This coalition was voted in office in 2021, and it's a testament to how much the world has changed since then. These parties were successful because of completely different reasons that today don't matter anymore. They were successful because of the green wave in the end of the 2010s. Then COVID played a role, and also how weak the CDU as an opposition force was after 16 years of Merkel. But these underlying causes for the electoral success back then are all gone by now, and for the for this new world, they just didn't have any answers. They didn't have an answer for the cost of living crisis. They didn't have an answer to the how to handle migration, and also this whole economic stagnation that is in Germany since 2022 in a constant stagnation, and 2025 is not going to be any better. They didn't have any answer for that. So obviously there is time for new elections.
Yeah, and Peter, Rich has indicated that the collapse of the support for Greens in response to the disasters of green policies in Germany surely plays a strong role in the collapse of the government more broadly.
Absolutely, yes. So apart from the chaotic immigration that the German government is failing to handle, also because they refuse the Australian approach at the EU level, there's the terrible state of the German economy. And this is linked to the large-scale energy experiments that Germany has been engaging in. It's not a good idea to mess around with your energy supply, and yet that is what Germany did. It is phasing out fossil fuels. This made them more dependent on Russia than otherwise. When Russia pulled the gas, Germany became very dependent on imports of expensive American LNG gas. Now it's very good that they still have gas at all, but of course it's not good that it's so expensive. The natural gas price in Europe in 2025 is expected to be 5 times the level as compared to America. So you don't have to be a genius to understand that this is a big problem for energy intensive industries in Europe, and Germany is the motor of the European economy. The chemical industry is badly suffering. BASF, a big German concern, they are divesting from Germany. They are investing in China, and it's all happening. If you look at the ETS, which is the European Union's climate tax, this in itself is higher than the total natural gas price in the United States. So this problem is entirely homemade. On top of that, we had this coalition, which is just, I think, beyond embarrassing. In the middle of a deep energy crisis in 2022, they decided to continue with shutting down perfectly functional nuclear power plants. You cannot make it up. The so-called liberal party, FDP, I'm sure they could have stopped it. They could have said, look, this is just an absolute emergency. At least we have to freeze this process. They did not. And now Christian Lindner, the inadequate leader of the FDP, he basically torpedoed the coalition, hoping that voters will forget. But I'm pretty sure they won't.
This whole issue of running out of money is linked to the constitutional debt break in the German constitution. And this leads again to European fiscal and monetary policies, because Germany is the core member of the Eurozone, and the Eurozone is set up in a way that encourages more and more debt in the member states, because there is through the European Central Bank there are mechanisms that are basically sharing the debt between the Eurozone members, and the debt that Germany doesn't take then can be taken up by France, by Italy, by Spain as far. So actually the forces on the political left who want to get rid of this constitutional debt brake has a very fair point. You are the stupid one to be fiscally responsible in this setup, and there are now many economists on the political right who say, okay, the best solution would be to have a responsible fiscal policy all in the entire Eurozone, but since we cannot have them, we get rid of the debt brake and just take on more debt and invest more into infrastructure and this kind of stuff, because the worst option is to be alone fiscally responsible in this Eurozone setup.
Well, looking ahead, I mean, what can we expect in the run-up to new elections, which are scheduled, I think, for February time? But what can we expect? Does anybody have an answer to these big both geopolitical, economic, political crises that are facing Germany? We saw throughout the year of elections where the AfD were gaining ground and also other parties. But does anyone really have an answer to the problems facing Germany, and what might we expect in the elections?
I think the perspective is better for the economy, because there are economic sound voices regarding economic policies. Regarding, for example, foreign policies or how to continue with the EU, the issue is much more complicated. One of the biggest and one of the most interesting aspects about the government coalition crisis was that it dragged on since 2022 almost, and the main political force that benefited from this was first the AfD, then the CDU and the CSU noted, okay, we need to do something. Then they became much more pronounced in the solutions. Then they gained also ground, and now the biggest question is who is. So we have now two forces who said that they are not going to do coalition with each other. Certainly the CDU excluded it, and. Regarding certain economic policies or migration issues, they can get along, but for example, on topics like Ukraine, they cannot. So we will have most likely we will have a majority in the new parliament that on certain matters could agree, but on others cannot, and it's going to be very challenging to form a new coalition out of this. Most likely the CDU is going to turn to the remnants of the Social Democrats or the Greens and somehow form a center-left coalition, but I don't think that, but the big problem will be that the AfD will be there most likely as second biggest force who can always outflank them from the right. It's going to be there is going to be a lot of political instability in the future.
Well, it depends a bit indeed if CDU and SPD have a majority. According to some opinion polls, it looks like, especially if the far left and the liberals would be under the electoral threshold of 5%. You would expect that then the biggest force, the CDU, will then reap some extra seats because of that, and narrowly have a majority. So then you would have such a coalition, of course, without Olaf Scholz. He will have to find a different job, which is
I'm sure he'll end up in Brussels.
Well deserved, probably. But yeah, in terms of policies, the CDU has sensible center-right policies. It's good that the CDU finally has a center-right leader again. You know, we had Merkel for a long time, who is, I mean, center-left, and that's putting it politely. And then we had some intermediate leaders who were very weak. So I think Merz in itself is a decent center-right leader with a proper vision for Germany. The question is, will he be able to implement his program? And I think what Germany needs, whether he's going to implement that or not, is to completely abandon all this green orthodoxy. And you know, maybe thanks to President Trump, we may actually be nearer to that than we think, because Trump is going to double down on fracking. On fossil fuels. The Federation of European Businesses, Business Europe, has said that European industry is becoming even more problematic when it comes to their competitiveness as a result of the fact that you have now Trump that is going, you know, full steam ahead. But then, you know, in Germany, especially among the media, the commentariat, green orthodoxy is some kind of religion. So will Merz dare to stand against that? We'll have to see it.
Well, I'll register my skepticism, as I always do, that any of these traditional parties, centre-left, centre-right, have really the kind of the vision or the courage to take some of the steps that are required. But I do actually want to get on to Trump, because this week we've seen reactions obviously rolling in from lots of European leaders to the election of Trump, but also at a time when lots of the big countries in Europe, obviously Germany is an example, but Macron as well in France, the position of lots of major European countries is very, very uncertain at the moment, and so the reaction to Trump's win has been very interesting. There's been a dynamic on the one hand of almost desperate, already trying to come up with proposals that might please Trump or stave off tariffs or whatever it might be, but also an undisguised shock and horror about the fact that he's won. What have you made, Richard, firstly, of how have the European leaders been reacting to Trump?
There has been some shock, but it was not as much as in 2016. 2016 was back then the European elites were completely unprepared for this. Now, because of Trump has already won the elections, they were prepared for the possibility of a Trump presidency. It doesn't mean that they have policy solutions for this case, because most of them just resignated. They just carry on with business as usual. Some are actually trying to extend their relations to the Trump coalition as much as possible. But I think the biggest surprise that they have got is how much support Trump got in minority communities, even in, for example, Arab American communities. Trump was number one. And this is something that many Europeans cannot wrap their head around. Like, how is this possible? This fascist Trump getting a lot of minority voters because they just said, "Oh, you're a migrant. You are certainly for open borders." They just took them completely for granted. And I think this is the biggest. The biggest impact of the Trump victory will be on the long run. How to deal intellectually with this Trump victory? How is this possible? Because it certainly does not fit into the identity politics narrative.
Correct. Yeah, Peter, what have you made of their reactions?
Well, yeah, I agree, and when you look at the strong support among minorities for Trump, I think these are typically working class. People in the United States that feel it is very unfortunate that you have people working illegally, undercutting their salaries. It's one thing if they compete fairly; it's another if you have this legion of illegal workers, and I do think that played a big role. Of course, none of that was known or appreciated by the mainstream in Europe. They had been banging on about Trump as some kind of a fascist, as always. I don't expect them to change their view anytime soon. I think what we now have on hand is, of course, a big negotiation with Trump on his tariffs. There's some speculation on what Trump will do. The UK government, for what it's worth, they think that Trump will not strike first, that he will not say, "Oh, here's a lot of tariffs and then let's negotiate." I think Trump understands that part of the reason he won was the high inflation. And of course, if you impose high tariffs, that's not going to make this problem any better. I would say that at the moment the biggest risk is not so much Trump. He's appointing some relatively, let's say, mainstream foreign policy figures now, so that's an indication. But it's the European Commission. The European Commission has prepared some kind of a game plan, and according to some rumors, they would be considering to strike first, to impose a tariff first, because in March, in theory, some EU tariffs that were going to come in. They will finally come in after the Commission had sort of said we'll hold off for it now. So I don't think you have to be an expert in Trump psychology to understand that this is not the best way to deal with him. Certainly when he's at the start of his second term, and he has lots of problems and challenges at his hand. The last thing he wants is the European Commission to sort of opening the trade war. So I think the responsible thing to do is to wait and to try to engage as much as possible. And Trump is going to have a whole list with demands for the EU to avoid tariffs, and actually quite a lot of things on that list will be very sensible, like, for example, reducing EU tariffs, but also scrapping some protectionist EU regulations.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that's been a little bit of a theme of commentary, and I think maybe rightly, has been that what this should be, we can have our skepticism as to whether it will be, but what this should be is a bit of a decision moment for Europe, for Europeans, for European leaders, for European elites, that on a whole host of issues, Europe has relied for so long on the leadership, the economic might and the military might of the United States to just solve problems, whether that be determining the course of the war in Ukraine or trying to dictate policy on Israel, or even the broad economic geopolitical policies about how we approach, say, China. And now there seems to be, finally, even if no one knows what to do about it, a bit of a dawning realization that we can't rely on America to solve these problems for us. Do either of you think that any of our crop of elites are up to working out what that kind of different vision of Europe might be like?
To be honest, I'm very glad that the Americans have to say in European foreign policy. If I look at the current chief diplomat of the European Union, Josep Borrell, I trust sometimes the Americans more than him. This how the EU has treated this post tells a lot. The first, since they have introduced the High Representative, as it's officially called, with the Lisbon Treaty, the first chief diplomat was Catherine Ashton. She was, this was more like a, how would you say in English, an honorary promotion. Mm-hmm. And then we had Federica Mogherini, who was a junior politician. And then we had Josep Borrell, who was basically a retiree, recalled to do into duty. So, and basically none of them had any severe impact on the world stage. They couldn't create any kind of EU foreign policy or something like that. And the main problem was actually not even the institutional problem behind this position is weak, that they have absolutely no conception how to do foreign policy, how to create a European sphere of influence of some kind, or to defend ours, because they are completely trapped in the 1990s somehow.
Yeah, and Peter, any chance of any kind of realization, either at the EU level or even at the national level, about the kind of scale of the challenges that we as Europeans have to face?
Well, European countries have been neglecting their defense for a few decades, especially Germany, Benelux, Sweden, France a little bit less. They have been more responsible or less irresponsible. Now some EU bureaucrats think that, this is a great crisis, Trump, that we should not let go to waste.
Yes.
And their obsession is more common debt to finance defense spending, to have an EU army ultimately. I think this is completely deluded. If you listen to the farewell speech of the former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in September 24, he basically criticized EU defense initiatives. He said already today these initiatives are duplicating NATO initiatives. Now, can you imagine when Trump tells European leaders to take NATO a lot more serious, that he hears about this duplication and that he hears about plans to even strengthen that, EU defense machinery, which is already annoying the workings of NATO. I don't think he was going to be very happy with that. So I think this is pie in the sky, and I hope and I think it's not going to happen.
Well, while people have been trying to work out their response to Trump, the kind of EU bubble here in Brussels has been having its kind of scheduled fascination moment where they get to pretend to put the European Commission through its paces by giving a grilling, which is really only a verbal grilling, to the potential commissioner picks. Now, most of this is probably sewn up, and we know that the EU Parliament really doesn't exercise much, if any, power when it comes to the commission picks. But has anything stood out for you in terms of how some of these showdowns have gone down?
Well, it creates the illusion that the commissioners are responsible to the parliament. At the same time, because these hearings are supposed to be serious ones, at the same time in the media, we can already follow up the news how the hearings will be set up so that certain outcomes will occur. So this is a complete... only an illusion of parliamentary control. It's this is why most parliamentary systems do not even notice hearings, because it's clear that there are political agreements in the background, and they should be just open about the political groups should be open about who they support, and do not bother with these hearings, because take responsibility.
Yeah, Peter, anyone particularly stood out for you, or can we piece together some of more of von der Leyen's agenda based on the responses of some of these commissioners?
Well, yeah, I mean, in itself, in theory, it's a good thing that, the executive is being interrogated and to see if they're competent for a start and what they think about certain issues. Of course, in practice, as you say, I mean, there's lots of deals being stitched up in the background that are actually, I would not say that we don't know about, but that are published about in the media. I mean, if you're talking about the commissioners that stand out, I think the most worrying commissioner, from my view, is the Spanish commissioner, Ribera. She's strongly on the left. She has a pretty poor track record in Spain. She, for example, was the driving force behind Spain and later the EU abandoning the Energy Charter Treaty, which is very important for investment, also actually in renewable energy. It's worrying that she will get the competition portfolio. She didn't really talk all that much about it, during the hearing, which already is an indication of how serious that she will take this task. But I think if you care about the EU, I mean, I'm often very critical about the EU, but I think fundamentally it could be a force for good if it would focus on its core business, which is to fight illegal state aid, to make sure that companies from small economies can fairly compete across the EU. Now the Commission has been neglecting that job with the Danish Commissioner Vestager over the last 10 years. It's been completely politicized. And it looks like things are going to be even worse with Ribera. So perhaps that's quite revealing already from these hearings.
So yeah, we'll obviously be following the kind of how the commissioner portfolios shape out. We'll be trying to expose as much as possible going on. We've already had a little bit of a look at some of the implications for free speech online and such like. But I do want to suggest to all of our viewers, if you're in Brussels or in the surrounding area, we'd love to see you at our conference next week. Culture War Goes Global, Geopolitics in a New Era. It really is an opportunity for us to touch on what we discussed here today about after Trump, does Europe have a few decisions to make? At one of our previous events, a speaker said it's time for Europe to grow up. And I think that sentiment is something that we really want to unpack at our conference next week. So I hope to see you there. But for now, thanks so much to Richard and Peter, and we'll see you on the podcast very soon.